เ Vanish with the thunder!
I got this one. How's that? Uh-oh.
Finish the mission.
Take Take this.